I'm Mark Gunzinger, Mitchell Institute's Director for Future Concepts and Capability Assessments, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be moderator for this distinguished panel who will discuss lessons learned from Midnight Hammer. So I think we all know that last June, the Air Force completed an extraordinary mission when its combat aircraft penetrated Iran, devastated the regime's air defenses, attacked nuclear targets with incredible degree of precision. And the success of that operation was due to the outstanding efforts of those who planned it, who flew it, and of course the maintainers that supported the operation. It was truly a team effort that, again, demonstrated our Air Force's ability to project air power globally into any threat environment. So moving forward, there are insights that should be gleaned from this operation that would do out to inform our Air Force's future force design, Department of War's force development efforts, and priorities writ large. So to discuss these insights, please welcome our panel, starting with Lieutenant General Jason Armagost. Now, ARMO is the Deputy Commander, Air Force Global Strike Command, and Deputy Commander, Air Force's Strategic Air with Strategic Command. We're also honored to have Jerry McBrearty, Vice President and B2 Program Manager from Northrop Grumman. Thanks, Jerry, for joining us. And as you know, global reach and global power, true global reach and global power, depends on our industry's ability to deliver unmatched capabilities like the B-2 and soon the B-21. And we are also pleased that Buzzer, Maj Claire Randolph, Chief of Weapons and Tactics at AFCENT, will be able to share her insights into what it takes to actually plan these kinds of operations. So panel, let's jump right into some questions, and I'll start with you, General Armagost. So you were involved in Midnight Hammer's planning and execution. Can you give us an overview, perhaps, of some of the challenges associated with preparing those kinds of missions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gonzo. And it's great to be up here with Jerry and Buzzer, who I watched light WEPTAC a fire a couple of years ago. She's pretty outstanding, and I'm sure she'll do the same on the panel here today. So the challenges of an operation like Midnight Hammer are pretty simple, actually. But what I would offer in how you got to the challenge or got through the challenge is the deeper history than even General Kane briefed on the day after the attack, where he talked about, for 15 years, this team at DTRA had looked at the target and had engineered kind of ways ahead, and we tested and developed weapons and gone through all of that. But it goes back even farther than that, and I would say, and there's even some people here in the room who participated all the way back to 2004 when we saw what Iran was doing with Natanz and that underground facility, and almost immediately in the B2 community we started trying to come up with concepts of operation about how you would get inside that space to deny sanctuary for a nuclear program at Natanz, first and foremost. And over the couple of years where we tested various things, we figured out that that was going to be a big challenge with the weapons portfolio that we already had. And so from that in 2006, the MOP was undertaken. And that turned into really an epic engineering story and an epic test story and kind of a relentless focus on how do you do something that sounds impossible on the surface, which is get through 200 feet of a mountain, because by 2006 we knew that Fordo was actually going to be the more critical target because it was literally under a mountain. So how do you get through 200 feet of a mountain and have a relatively small amount of high explosive but encased in almost 26,000 pounds of steel get into a space predictably, reliably, in an engineered fashion so that you get the effect and you can deny that space? And so that was actually a very, very long journey, but kind of coincident with that, and this gets back to the challenges that I think were met in the execution of that operation, is the intelligence piece. So one of the things that I think is really a great trait, actually, of the B2 community, the all-aspect stealth community, frankly, is they understand kind of the lethal embrace that you have with intelligence and execution in operations. And that is very, very deep. It's a requirement to understand the environment you're going into in very complicated ways so that you can affect that environment and the kill chains that your adversaries have built so that you can manipulate them or exploit them or cause them to be irrelevant. And so those two things, I think, are really key components of the challenges that were kind of culturally met over a very long period of time and culminated on the night of 21st and 22nd of June this year. I would also say, so adding, we have partners and allies in the room, Japan, Australia, I think I saw Australians here as well, and Brits. Those partners and allies become essential, particularly when you have an operation like Midnight Hammer that requires a degree of secrecy and coordination that is really kind of off the charts. And so that really only plays out again over time where those relationships are very solid and established so that you can capitalize on those together at the point of need. Because in AFCENT, they were working around the clock to get that last tactical mile really solved. But it is so much more in a global operation like that, where that's a 36-hour sortie that requires really people around the world. And I'll just leave you with this, and we can move on. In the 3 months prior to that operation, we kind of got indications based on what Iran was doing to Israel via proxies and themselves that something could be afoot. And so on 12 April, President Trump, that was when he drew the red line, if you remember. He said, you got 60 days. It ended up being a little more than 60 days, but he said, you have 60 days to come to the table and negotiate on this. And that was actually a really key moment because that's when we knew we were going to go deeply down this path to be ready to conduct that kind of operation. But that involved me at Barksdale and through the 608th dealing with basically 6 combatant commands almost every day so that we could get CENTCOM all the things they needed to actually execute.
Thanks, General. Let's step it up a level, maybe 2, as a follow-up for you. So you mentioned allies. What message did Midnight Hammer send to certainly our adversaries, but as well as our allies? And what kind of message would it be sending if we continue to allow, because of a lack of resources or other reasons, if we allow our global strike forces to continue to diminish as they have in the past?
Yeah. So I think kind of an interesting moment looking back was when Secretary Hegseth first came in, one of the things you would hear him say pretty routinely was, reestablish deterrence, reestablish deterrence, reestablish deterrence. But late March timeframe, he actually started changing what he was saying. And it was kind of clear to me because I was trying to pay attention to what our part of reestablishing deterrence would be. He started saying, reestablish strategic deterrence. And it's a nuance, but I think it's actually really important because we saw even then what it was going to take, and I'll say it this way. So Bomber Task Force, I think there's some familiarity probably pretty broadly in the room with what we do with Bomber Task Force. Usually it's about 60% of any given year. We have bombers forward in various combatant commands, flying with partners and allies, forward in theaters, and integrating. And it's a really important activity. In fiscal year 25, so October of 24 through essentially last October, in addition to that 200 plus days of Bomber Task Force, we had a month more than that of forward deployed bomber combat operations. And in the previous 2 years, so back to FY24, really January of 24 when it started, after October of 23, every single bomber wing, not widely known, but every single bomber wing has been conducting combat operations in the last 2 years. And so that's kind of the difference in the challenge. So that bomber ecosystem beyond the B-2s was something we had to consider at Global Strike Command about how do you make ready if this raid doesn't happen or doesn't go the way you want it to. So.
Yeah, because deterrence really is a combination
Yes.
of will and incredible capability.
Yep.
Yep. All right, so Buzzer, a mission like this has many, many moving parts, as you well know. But To the extent you can, could you help describe a few of the critical challenges that you must address when planning operations like this?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And first, I want to say thanks for letting me be here, sir. I told General Deptula I would definitely achieve one objective, which is either convince you need to have more majors at panels like this or that you should never invite them again. So thanks. I think a couple of critical challenges specifically for this mission included the major engineering challenge, which General Armagost already talked about. Then we had the force packaging challenge, which is the job. So that wasn't an unforeseen challenge, but it is really complex to do it over effectively a day-and-a-half period. And that's simply the job. So it's a challenge, but it's what we do. There are a couple of other challenges that sort of snuck up on us, I think. The first one I want to mention is OPSEC. We talked just now in the last panel about blue AI capabilities, but we didn't spend a lot of time talking about adversary AI capabilities or even civilian AI capabilities. I mean, you've got Twitter feeds of randos that are just studying where our airplanes go and publishing it, consolidating it. Like, if U.S. analysts did some of that, we would consider it secret or maybe even top secret. But that stuff is just allowed on the open internet. So operational security, especially when you're talking about a transnational movement with hundreds of aircraft, is really, really difficult to conceal. So OPSEC is a really big concern. I think, and actually reading a recent article about the 35th anniversary of Desert Storm, it's funny that this one is the same. Clarity of intent is also a problem, and having a clear and stable intent is really important. I think it's very difficult to plan these missions. The synchronization, as I mentioned, is really challenging. But we need to know what we're doing. And it's very difficult to plan 20 or 30 different versions of the mission where you are tasked to achieve very different levels of intent. So I think getting clear and stable intent through the planning process is something that we really need. I'll also highlight that the ambiguity and uncertainty within intel during the actual fog and friction of modern warfare is a really big problem. So I think when we train, you know exactly how many SAMs there are, you generally know what ellipse they're in, you know what brigade they belong to, but in reality, you may or may not know what the denominator is for a lot of these adversary threats, much less actually where they're located. And I think we've sort of white-carded intel and training for such a long time that we've forgotten that there's resource constraints and resource scarcity when it comes to building awareness. So I think that was a really big problem. And then finally, I'll just add, I think the last challenge is after 20-some years of GWAT, where we had the highest levels of general officer making the call on when a mission was executed, that simply does not work with modern air combat. We have to be willing, I mean, this is one major's opinion, but we have to be willing to delegate some of those decisions down to lower levels, and it's very, very difficult to build a plan where on the, if you imagine your red flag contracts card where you have 3- and 4-star generals as the hammer for all of your contracts. Air combat simply doesn't work that way. So I think those were a couple of the challenges that specifically stuck up on us for Midnight Hammer.
Absolutely.
It actually is useful. So one of the things about 2 weeks out I started to see happening was kind of that confluence of a lot of 4-stars who thought they were the decider, who weren't actually the decider. The president was the decider, right? And that was pretty clear from the red line discussion. But in execution of operations, you probably saw it too, there was a lot of people kind of trying to stir the pot, right? And so I think one of the things that was really important was a decision contract that was built. And General Kane, to his great credit, said, this is how it's going to happen. And there were 3 kind of key moments for that. And it set aside kind of the noise of command and control and made it an executable thing. But I think that needs to become kind of a standard going in proposition.
Excellent. Planning for uncertainty. Buzzer, building on your thoughts, what we just discussed, how do mission planners prepare for unforeseen events in the middle of long-duration operations like this? And I'll tell you, I once flew a 33-plus hour sortie to Egypt and back, and this was shortly after the Gulf of Sidra incident, and Muammar Gaddafi said, well, we're going to intercept you on your way home, and they tried. But our planners had prepared for that and had a contingency, and he never quite made it into range of our aircraft. Then we lost an engine, emergency air refueling, all that. But again, the planners had an approach to handle those kinds of situations.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great point, and it is something that in my observation of working with a lot of, studying our adversaries and working with a lot of our partners, this is something that I think the U.S. Air Force does exceedingly well, is that we have a lot of authority delegated to the pilot in command, and that's sort of a sacred paradigm, is that when you're the PIC, you own what happens to your aircraft, and you're responsible for the members on it if it's more than just you. And so I think having that sort of like paradigm of sacredness around the pilot in command construct. We also have two sort of new emerging ones. This is not really that new, hopefully, but mission command as well as like functional team lead command. So once you're in the lane and you're outside of the range of tactical or operational command and control, the mission commander owns the mission. And if you can't even reach the mission commander because maybe that person is ground-based C2, then you have a functional team lead, whether that's your strike team lead or your suppression of enemy air defenses team lead. And in the U.S. Air Force, we give those guys a lot of authority, and we let them train that way in exercises like Bamboo Eagle, where they're really stretching the distance of command and control, as well as red flag. So I think that's something that's really helpful, is we empower our operators to actually make decisions for themselves once they're outside of range from the Bobs who are trying to reach them. And I think that that's really healthy. There are limitations to that, but I think practicing like we play and sort of safeguarding the sacredness of pilot and command and mission command authorities is the only way that we handle that.
I want to add something on that too,
Absolutely.
because it's really important as we kind of decide the strategic nature of our stand-in, stand-off, and our kill chains and our command and control. If we do not architect our comms better going forward, that is a foul on us,
Hear,
big
hear.
time. Because if that package is not able to, in a low probability detect and or low probability of intercept way, able to communicate the status of their forces and the go from the mission commander, then that is bad on all of us.
And actually, sorry, not to make this pile on city here, but I think it's really interesting as we talk about, what if we had this network where everybody was able to talk to everybody all the time? There are a couple of effects that we care about. You care about getting intelligence into the cockpit. You care about getting targets into the cockpit, orders, authorizations into the cockpit. But the problem is, once you can connect, like let's imagine you have a wire direct from the CENTCOM commander to the cockpit of every B-2 or the cockpit of every F-16, there's liability there to add latency and maybe decision-making authority without all of the awareness. And so I think as we tread into 100% agree, sir, we have to improve our communications capabilities, but we also have to be very careful to bound the authority that ends up touching the cockpit, because otherwise we're at risk for involving folks in the decision-making process that frankly have no business being there.
Okay, so let's talk about sustaining the mission. Ooh, you got him there.
Sorry. No offense.
No, I told you Buzzer's going to light it on fire.
Hey, Jerry. So Northrop Grumman, industry writ large, has a huge role to play in ensuring that our combat aircraft, B-2s, remain ready to meet the Air Force's operational needs when they're needed. Would you please explain to our audience the role that your company plays as a surrogate for all of the defense industry in ensuring that in the run-up to Midnight Hammer, the assets are in place, they're ready, and you can help maintain that readiness?
Yeah, great question, and thanks all for the opportunity. Just a personal anecdote first. It's kind of special for me. My grandfather worked for Kelly Johnson back in 1955. He actually stepped foot in this building, so this is a unique moment to be up here with Armo and Buzzer and you as well, Gonzo. First things first, I came off the Sentinel program 4 years ago, and having worked with General Bartolome on that program. And when we were looking at the strategic roadmap for B-2, there was a big fat red line that said do not field out in the 2030s. And we really fundamentally led that to a crossing the Rubicon year in 2025, where we were looking for big things to happen. And I can tell you it was the most powerful year, I believe, in the platform's history. That's because at Northrop, we really touch every life cycle of the jet. So you kind of have all things going on at once. Even though this is a fully fielded weapon system, the upgrades with our hardware and software development, right, to Armo's point about what is the comm strategy, to our sustainment challenges that we have in getting enough airplanes mission capable on the ramp, and then the sustainment question writ large, right? How many parts do we need down and in? I think the fundamental change that we've seen On the Northrop side is that commander's intent on what this platform can do. When you look at stealth capabilities from a range, access, payload, these three big buckets keep coming back up again, and they're on full display. All of that leads to how we position the business, and it fundamentally is shoulder to shoulder. So Buzzer talked about mission planning. So our teams at Whiteman Air Force Base, shoulder to shoulder with the airmen and women to go plan these things. And I think that we've always bet on the over on B2. If you go back 40 years and you look at the number of changes that have occurred to this platform, this is a platform that's been upgraded over that 40 years to do what it did last year and to continue to do what it needs to do. So really a pleasure to sit in this seat and to provide those layers of puzzle pieces that have to happen down and in hardware and software to meet the large number of O-plane requirements that this jet needs to do. So thanks.
Excellent. So Armo and Jerry, or both of you, of course, feel free to ring in. The B-2 is the world's best operational bomber. I don't think anyone stress on operational because we have B-21 coming on soon. But the Air Force took delivery of the last new production B-2 in 1997. So would you please share your thoughts on why it's critical to develop and field the next generation of stealthy aircraft for counter-air, for strike, and for other missions to keep pace with the adversaries, to outpace our adversaries?
So the original buy for that was 132, and the B-52 was going to be retired. So picture a world what that would mean if we had 132 B-2s right now. It would be significantly different, I would argue, because what you can do with a small number of aircraft is more than order of magnitude when you start talking about numbers that are significantly greater, because it is not a linear curve of the effect of all aspect stealth in an operational environment. It is logarithmic, or it's probably logarithmic. But it really the curve goes up fast when you start having a lot of those aircraft in the same space and attacking from multiple axes with a large capacity of weapons. And if you get the weapons portfolio correct, then you can do a lot of different things kind of simultaneously, which we also just saw, by the way, in Absolute Resolve a few weeks ago, where a very small number of bombers participated in that and had a massive effect over a very short amount of time in support of that package that was actually larger, much larger than Midnight Hammer. And so that's the difference. That's the story behind what if, right? And so now we have the opportunity with B-21 and family of systems to be different again, but it is going to require us to think about the right numbers of aircraft, because if you want to campaign, if you want to deter, actually, you're going to have the ability to not just have capability, but a capability presence that comes from just sheer numbers.
Let me add on a couple of things. I think one of the most powerful advantages that we have is the proximity of B-2 and B-21, right? When we look at what's been penned by Air Force Global Strike Command and the capability sets that we have, one of the greatest advantages we have, or one of the things that we can learn, that's an arrow that can go both ways. I think one of the first things is people process tools. The first thing is we are now hiring our 4th generation of Northrop Grumman employees who will work on B-2. And the same will be true for that, that information, that wisdom, right, in stealth technology that goes right into the 6th generation platform on B-21. I think from a process standpoint, we had a really great recent example of where this gets borne out, where Aircraft 129, Spirit of Georgia, she had a left main landing gear incident at Whiteman back in 2021. We called B-21 for innovative composite scarf material repairs to maintain this stealth expertise, and that was all under the Northrop hood to make sure we could go rapid, we could go quickly. And I think the tool sets, one of the most underappreciated things when I blend together sort of Sentinel, B-2, and B-21 is the power of sort of 3 things. I think the first thing is architectural decomposition between what is nuclear safety critical and what is mission domain, right? There's a lot of extra homework, right, that I don't have to do when I can move into what we call the mission domain. On B-2, this is the multi-mission domain, where I can rapidly iterate with Armo and Buzzer and his crew, and they can fly down in the T-38s to the WSIC, and we can actually put in those software updates that they want in my next 2-week sprint. And I think it's these sorts of rapidly coupled software-centric updates that we're getting after. The second thing is the sort of DevStar Ops alignment across the nuclear portfolio is significant. That allows you to take years out of these development programs where I can peek and poke into other software repositories to help me go quicker with all the homework I need to do for independent verification for airworthiness and other things. And the last thing is, I think one of the most special things we have in the B2 and the strike family is the proximity to Air Force Global Strike Command and the acquisition community that has to move quickly. Our ability to get Air Force fingerprints on what our teams are working on the next day is the way that we go fast. And we see this borne out now with much more clarity on what the roadmap looks like into the next decade. But we're talking to the operators, not to, I'll say a higher level software chief engineer. You're talking to the operators about what they need right now. That's where you see the pace of these upgrades to answer the mail for Operation Midnight Hammer and others, along with a technology roadmap that supports what we're talking about. And I think the very last thing is, we really see a lot of advantage to matching the weapon to the platform. You look at Midnight Hammer with MOP alignment to B2s. The same is true for the numerous 1067s for the weapons integration on the B2 that only she can carry. And so that's a big focus for us. Again, sort of this software forward but weapon paired approach that we have on the platform.
And so I will add, so that is a unique set of kind of operator paired acquisition or industry paired activities that actually came from the smallness of the community, because I think they saw how they had to move quickly together, and that may not have happened if we had 132 B2s. It probably would have been institutionalized and not driven to that kind of performance, which kind of is what we see out of the RCO and what I think in defense transformation now is being talked about. That was done through the B2, and clearly the need was met with new programs.
Actually, if I can just do a quick software pylon. For those who haven't read the Defense Reformation from a couple years ago by Shyam Sankar, he mentions in the end of it that software is the most powerful weapon system and malleable. And I think it's really interesting that this is a huge pro for the B2, but other communities either have or do not have this capability. F-16s own their own code, and we saw what they were able to do rapidly putting Falco on the airplane. Strike Eagles ended up working around the software problems and putting it on the airplane in 8 days. And we have lots of platforms that we are procuring that still don't have the software that we paid for. And we have no hope of making it malleable in that way in the future. And so as we build our procurement loops, I think we have to take into account the fact that we have to be able to modify ourselves faster than that adversary can modify their OODA loop against us. And I think we've not done that widely across most Air Force platforms.
Well, and just to make it perfectly clear what's actually being talked about here, the key point was the separation of the mission software from the airworthiness piece so that you are not reliant on an OFP drop to be able to just do something really quickly with a weapon, a new weapon, or a different way to use a weapon.
A double pylon. One additional thing is how do we short circuit operator feedback? One of the innovative ways we did was there was Air Force appetite for their own software development kit to write their own software back into what we'll call open systems architecture mission domain. That just plugs back into the B2 repos, right? We call it Spirit Realm. Stole the name of the airplane and plugged it into a software factory. But that's table stakes now, right? That's the 72nd and the 131st and the 509th and our SPO counterparts plugging in directly to these repositories. And so we see appetite for that, right? We provide the guardrails on what's going to work when you drop it into the software stack. That's the kind of pace that we're getting after to answer the mail.
Sure. I'd like to get into force capacity. We'll do that in a minute. Let's hit mix first, capabilities mix. For all of you, how should lessons learned from Midnight Hammer inform the mix of capabilities that our Air Force is going to need in the future, not just for one-off raids, but for large-scale air campaigns against a peer adversary? And that includes not just bombers, but munitions, ISR, and other aircraft perform other missions. And it also includes the mix of our standoff, and penetrating capabilities. So it'll be great to hear your perspective on that. And Jerry, your perspective as well on industry's ability to change to meet different requirements and change the mix.
Okay, so the B-2 in 2004 or so, maybe 2005, actually I guess it was a little earlier, the decision was made that it was going to carry 80 500-pound JDAMs versus trying to wicker in 240 SDBs. So I think that's an interesting, discussion, right? I don't think anybody at the time was envisioning why you would ever need to carry more than something for 80 targets. And it was impressive what you could do with just those simple general purpose weapons. But now, if you can take that a step further and think about what you could do with 240 SDBs, you're starting to talk about what we're actually designing into future systems, which is smaller modular capabilities that are form-fit to actually have the range and capability for the platform host. Because you can do different things with penetrating platforms and general purpose weapons or smaller weapons that you can't do just based on the physics of flyout for standoff weapons. It's stark the difference you can get, but that's why the mix is actually important as well, because that range of capabilities is actually what I would argue is deters. You have to have and prove that you can gain access to hold any target at risk, hold it at risk, keep it at risk, and then carry out orders and provide options. That can happen from standoff, and it can happen from penetrating, but in combination, those things are incredibly powerful.
Let me jump in real quick on a thought. Back in the era of the long-range strike bomber study that preceded, obviously, the B-21, one of the conclusions out of that study was it's better to design a platform, a combat platform, and then optimize weapons for the platform rather than optimize the platform for currently existing munitions. Is that still true?
Absolutely. So it's one of the reasons why today, with the weapons or the platforms we have fielded, why there's a different discussion about what you put on a B-52 versus what you put on a B-2. The access you've bought with the platform is different, and so you can do different things with those two. Both of them can be very important. And in the aggregate, together, it's very powerful. But don't give up space on a platform that you've bought access with for the platform itself. Maximize that and really make it something that can change the script.
And I'll add for the mix part of this, I think, as always, we want to start target backwards. So I think there are kind of like three big categories of targets I would want to talk about. One is hardened, deeply buried targets, which require a very specific type of munition, which is often, and I can't scientifically think of anything that isn't stand-in that does that right now. Maybe we'll figure that out in the future, but hardened, deeply buried targets are critical, and if our adversaries are learning anything from our operations, they're starting to put more things underground, and the Earth is a pretty difficult thing to penetrate, so hardened, deeply buried targets are one, and scientifically, I think right now those are stand-in, which requires, some type of kill chain disruptor, whether it's amazing EW or stealth or whatever it is that gets you into the target, and you have to be big enough to carry really, really huge bombs for hardened, deeply buried targets. Then you have surface targets, which aren't mobile, so then that's pretty easy. You can toss a bunch of SDBs. The Navy has JSOW. We don't really have a great solution for mid-range missiles or bombs anywhere between, JDAM range and JASM range. We don't have a lot of things that fit in well there, which is a huge problem for surface targets. And then we also have mobile targets, and surface mobile targets are really difficult because you can't just use 240 SDB to go kill a bunch of SAMs if you don't know where they are, or if that weapon is super slow and easily detected and shot down by adversaries, then that might not be the best thing to do. So I think if we start target backwards, munitions-wise, you need to have a force that can support stand-in strikes until we are able to do hardened, deeply buried targets from standoff, which may not ever happen. And we need to have the quantity of weapons to hit surface targets. So I'll have a little bit more about ISR and SEED, but I'll let you pitch in on the...
Yeah, I'll just pitch in a little bit, pull stick back slightly, right? We reversed engineered all that to say you're going to have like a menu of available options for weapons integration rapidly onto the platform. and that's going to be various sizes. That's going to be, different interface requirements. And so, kudos to the original design architecture where there was spare hardware and software, spaces on this airplane to go do that, right? So coupled back with the other program and the Strike family, it's made that very easy for us to go quickly. So I think that's important. I think from a supply side, the interest really has never been higher. 25 really fundamentally shifted, I think, what we're talking about in interest, not just in software and AI components, but also hardware. The upgraded comms plan, new displays, all these new capabilities for this aircraft really touch a lot, hundreds and hundreds of suppliers existing today, and there's growth in those numbers too. I think our biggest challenge is getting clarity around sustainment goals for the B-2 fleet. I think, if we're going to start really necking down into how to go fast, that's a huge opportunity for us to look at the supply base with clear commander's intent, from Armo and others on exactly what we need that number to be. Provides extreme clarity down into how I, incentivize the supply base. Don't just buy 19. By 100, right? And how do we do that with the supply base will be very important as we work that in the coming months.
And just a couple of things to add for the rest of the force mix. I think we have to consider certainty in the adversary's order of battle as a part of our calculation, and investing in an ISR fleet, whether it's space-based or air-based or ground-based or whatever based. We have to consider that our certainty directly affects the mass and mix of forces that we need to actually prosecute the war. So if we have really high certainty, you could do a lot more standoff, you can do a lower risk mission with a lot fewer forces, but if you have low certainty, you have to get in there. And if you're gonna get in there, you have to have forces that are survivable, reactive, and so I think in a resource scarce ISR world, we're currently living in a world where we need to have a stand-in capable force until we're able to fill that certainty gap, and I think that comes with a lot of investment in seed, and we need that to be have some mass in order to protect our bombers.
I want to just pile in on the ISR piece because I kind of hinted at it earlier, and you kind of just directly pointed it out. But this is okay. Different communities can see the intelligence problem, the ELINT problem, the SIGINT problem differently. But what they have to agree on and what they have to come to the conclusion on is what's real and what is the operational pattern that is being exhibited. Because if you don't have those facts to be able to overlay the ints on the platforms, what you end up with is disagreement as to what needs to be killed, what's the risk or survivability of the mission itself. And you could get kind of some war of the tribes that doesn't add up to the right answer, which is mission accomplishment. You could get outcomes that are dependent that shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's interesting. For everyone, we have copies of our report of our last war game. It's pre-release copy, and it hits one of the insights of games hits some of these points. It talks about how there is a need to develop more information, better intelligence on the kinds of targets that we might strike in a defense of Taiwan scenario. They have the greatest strategic impact on their campaign, on their resources, on their ability to launch salvos and missiles at our bases, our airmen and planes. So let's get into those capacity questions. So let's start with our uniform panelists. We know that our Air Force is the only service in the world capable of missions like Midnight Hammer. We heard that again this morning. That said, there are 19 B-2s, I believe. Got that number right? Yeah. Okay. And that's enough for a one-off rate.
Where did Ken and Bell go? There's actually not on.
So can you describe growth in the bomber inventory and crew ratios that's needed to create a force that really is capable of sustaining a protracted air campaign against a peer adversary?
So we always start with the most strategic O-plans, right? You have to be able to generate the people, the airplanes, the weapons for the most stressing case, or the worst day, rather, for STRATCOM or for the nation. And so, but if you never go beyond that, you actually don't see how all of that connects back through conventional weapons portfolios, crew ratios, sustainment of the aircraft, MC rates, all the things that would require you to keep a force active and alive, back to the readiness discussion from earlier. And so it's really important, I think, to just focus on the diversity of the requirements on our long-range air power. It kind of blew my mind when I say I was talking to 6 combatant commands, different combatant commands a day in the weeks prior to the execution of Midnight Hammer. That was really the case. And the dependencies, we are the only Western nation with bombers, but we couldn't do it without our partners and allies. There's no way we could have transited where we did or flown tankers from locations where we did. And it's always fascinating to me that we have these dependencies and we have our allies that are willing to step into the breach with us on these. But that's not always the case. There are also examples, hopefully not well known, but there are examples where that didn't materialize in the way we would hope. And so I just think that's really important to call out the ecosystem of all of the bombers, not just in the case of the B-2, what's happening in the world, what are the hidden requirements that are inbound that nobody's talking about.
Including crew ratios.
Yes.
What's our current B-2 crew ratio? It's about 1.0, I believe.
Well, so there's a book number, and then there's the reality number, right? And those never actually quite match. This happens across all the platforms. It happened when I was a lieutenant at Misawa. I remember crew ratios, the discussion being changed back then, and I didn't even know what it meant. But we tend to save money because the requirement in effect is diminishing, but in actuality, if you're talking about putting bombers back on alert, if you're talking about having combat operations across multiple combatant commands in different theaters, you're not going to do it with the crew ratios we have.
13, 14-hour sorties?
Nope. Yeah, on the short side.
Yeah.
So.
And I'll just add, in terms of resources, there is the amount of iron, the amount of weapons. But then we also have to think about the stocks and flows of delays, kind of going back to that systems thinking we were talking about earlier. If we had exactly the number of weapons we needed, it wouldn't be enough because they would be all over the world. And then we would have to take into consideration the amount of airlift or sea lift that's required to get them where they're going. And then we have to make the assumption that we're going to be decisive enough to make the call 60, 90 days in advance to move all of those weapons. And so I think we're not doing the rest of the homework regarding the rest of the system. We're sort of calculating, just like the general said, what is the worst case scenario, and then we're building a blue sky game plan off of that without really considering the rest of the systems architecture. And then I'll also add, with respect to readiness, so you can have the right amount of crews, but if your crews aren't good enough or quality enough or trained enough to actually be able to do the thing, and the B-2 specifically has a really tough problem because their missions are their admin phase can be really threatening and difficult. And it's very, very difficult to train guys how to transit an ocean with a sunrise and a sunset, avoid commercial aviation from seeing you if you never have the opportunity to train on a 37-hour sortie. And so I think we have to consider the wholeness of the system, including stocks, flows, and delays. And then we also have to start considering some type of quality metric, which copy that we're having, CRIs, but I don't know that is a real quality metric for how well our forces are able to perform their specified combat tasks. So we do a lot of quantity and beam counting, but we have to bring in a quality metric and make sure that we're giving our crews the resources, both in time and space and money, to train effectively.
Yeah, I'll just give a little quick anecdote because it's funny. The very first time I made a transatlantic or transoceanic position report, I actually had to break out the flight information handbook before I keyed the mic to read exactly what I was going to say on night 1 of OIF because I'd never done it before. And so that's the complexities that are layered into something like that.
Great.
I think I made the call correct, but
I'm
I'm still not sure.
Okay, so another capacity question. We've heard multiple times today how true global reach and power depends on a family of systems, and that family of systems includes our tanker force. During the Cold War, we sized our tanker force to support our bomber force in the execution of emergency war orders. So panel, can you offer your thoughts on sizing and shaping our future tanker force, to support a campaign of these kinds of long-range operations, not, again, one-offs?
So the first thing I worry about when something like a Midnight Hammer starts to take shape is, hey, what's the tanker force looking like, and what's the position of it, and how do we posture the world to be able to actually do this? And it's not an easy thing. It's really, I think, interesting how the B-52 and the KC-135 were born together and were structured together. The force was developed in a way that that was designed in. In fact, if you go back to the wings, you would see that you had bombers and tankers at the same location. They would fly together, they would train together, they would take off together, and that has not been reality now for quite a long time. But we have fed off the carcass of that force design for decades, and so that carcass, I think we've found the limits of what we can do with that. But yet again, the airmen find ways to pull it off in the last second with a raid mentality, but that is not going to suffice for a campaign.
Day after day after.
No.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that. I worry a lot about the tankers and the mobility aircraft. Like moving a Patriot requires many double-digit, tens of C-17 movements. And as you approach true major combat operations, again, more resource scarcity on the ground-based air defense front, there's going to be a lot of required movement there. And I think if I were writing, our request list, our shopping list for procuring things, probably the first 100 things on there would be tankers. Because we talk about going back to crew training, in Operation Rough Rider, we had instructor pilots who couldn't get on the boom, lights out. And we can laugh at them all we want, but if they don't get the opportunities to train, you can't hold them accountable for something that's not their fault. So, just like General Ploy said earlier, so we have to have enough. I mean, you think about the demands on tankers, DV movements, Noble Eagle, Alert, the nuclear mission, all these other things going on at the same time. And then we talk about, especially if we're always trying to leave any opportunity for diplomacy open until the last second, then we end up trying to move everything very quickly at the last moment, which is both an OPSEC concern, because now we're having to call our friends on Signal and say get on alert. We would never do that, of course. It creates a huge OPSEC spike, and then you have to do coronet missions at the same time, and you have to set up for the bombers, and it's chaos. And I think because it's not sexy, it's not a weapon, and it's not a fighter, and it's not a bomber, the tankers are often really left out of this conversation. So I'm very concerned about our MCO readiness to execute tanker campaigning and campaign airlift, going back to contested logistics.
In the 60 days prior to a run-up of a major theater operation, that the president isn't going to be moving around the world doing all kinds of things, destroying your plan, your posture, then you're not thinking through reality.
Yeah, and let me just add, we talk about a lot of this in mission planning realm, right? And we're seeing this pop up a lot. So I would continue to just ask for those warfighter insights right into this B-21 universe and B-2. That's where the magic of mission planning really comes out on the access question. It's a big deal. So tracking.
And not to dog on where we ended up with our tanker force and airlift force, I think it was a calculated risk decision based on the likelihood and consequence of MCO. But now the likelihood and consequence of a single major combat operation or simultaneous major combat operations has changed, I would assess, rather dramatically recently. And now we've put ourselves in a situation where we may not have the ability to get ourselves out of it very quickly. And so I think this is probably a conversation we have to have with the heads of the airlines and so on and so forth. But tankers and airlift are a big gap, I think.
Okay, panel, so we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to do a lightning round of questions and then give you a couple minutes each to kind of wrap up. So I'd like to touch on the human element of these kinds of operations. Now, flying nonstop from Whiteman and other bases to Middle East and back with multiple air refueling, so that's a pretty tough task. My longest mission was a little over 33 hours, and a certain part of my anatomy is still flat. But how do we prepare our airmen for these kinds of missions? What do they do to get ready to execute them? So
we've learned a lot, I would say, over decades, and we actually learned a lot during the global war on terror from that. So I have a little over 900 hours in the B-2. just under 80 hours of which is 2 sorties, which still, like, if I might survive if I was you, but I would not survive doing that today. And so there's a very high demand on the physiological, the physical, the mental, and the crew aspect of that. How do you execute something like that? And if you're wondering if it's like riding in a Boeing or an Airbus when you're going back to San Diego, it's not. It's loud. There's a lot of vibration. It's hot in places. It's cold in places. It's just not designed for that kind of environment. So it's really essential that you have people trained and ready to go do really hard air refueling. And refueling a flying wing is a challenge. It's probably the most difficult thing about the B-2, I would argue. And if you have weather, you have all the factors that go in with time slips. It can be very demanding very quickly. And so really that we have to prepare and get our circadian rhythms right. You have to eat right. You have to be fit in a degree. And that's a decisive factor, actually, when you build a crew lineup. You might say, hey, that person is not ready to go do this incredibly demanding sortie.
Got it. Okay, other mission forces. So we've said family of systems a number of times. That family of systems includes ISR, electronic warfare, and other aircraft as well. So you have some insights perhaps on the roles those aircraft played in the success of Midnight Hammer and operations like that, and how that should inform our future force development to include penetrating ISR, penetrating EW, possibly CCA, and so forth.
So I would say, I'll turn over to Jerry here because he'll have an interesting perspective from the industry perspective, but my concept of a family of systems has only grown over time. There are dependencies for every single partner we interact with on the execution of a mission like this. It may not be, not everybody's going to get invited to the White House like the B-2 crews did. But I will tell you that there was somebody in Spain, there was somebody in Maine that absolutely made this mission happen, and it wouldn't have happened without them. Now, back to the family of systems, I think you can really design in some unique attributes across a system of systems that is additive more than the sum of its parts. And so that, from a force design perspective, you get some really, really interesting things happening if you can properly integrate those families of systems.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it turns back into this, reverse engineering on the people, process, and tools again, right? The sharing of 40 years of B2, stealth legacy knowledge infused with, today's software engineers, right? And cross-pollinating those two things across the family of systems is dramatically powerful when we look at what we have to do on both of those programs. I think second thing is that's really incentivizing the supply base to see both programs together almost when you look at how quickly we have to go. So we see a lot of interest in, we don't want to just, buy 19, but how about the other program? That's a powerful strike family narrative that goes down and into the supply base now. And so I think about that with other platforms, right? When we talk about tankers and we talk about B2s, where does that overlap, right? In a supply base question, from a mission planning standpoint question. And you talk about capacity. I mean, the significant multi-year investments across all the tier ones. At Northrop, this is north of $13 billion of internal investment to make these things happen while we hash out the bigger questions. That's a significant amount of money to be ready for these things, because we know that, commander's intent across these mission planning scenarios is challenging. But once we have it, like in 25, you completely change the business space, right, on who wants to be on these platforms. So a dramatic change when you can bundle these programs and platforms makes a very powerful story down and into the supply base for industrial capacity.
And I think talking about the family of systems, there are sort of, and I don't mean family of systems as all the new people who have the read-ins talk about it. I mean like the actual whole of the Air Force family of systems. I think there are sort of two principles that I gleaned from the Midnight Hammer experience. The first is that it is important to define the nouns that go with high-low mix. I think what we really care about is high PK and low cost. Just because they're high doesn't mean they have to be high cost. Like if they're not high PK, then we don't really care. And there are some scenarios where low cost,
Great point.
high PK solutions do exist. So I don't think we should be intentionally seeking out really expensive things. We should be seeking out high PK things, and we should be willing to pay the bill even if they're expensive. And then again, going back to the target backwards thing earlier, we need to examine the types of targets that we're actually going to be responsible for hitting in combat and make sure we have a solution to all of those targets that is effective and available and the mass needed. And so, like, take for example, nobody else can do what the B-2 does with MOP. So that's the only solution. So it has to be available wherever we need it. But if you take a look at maybe a GBU-31V3, you could take into account, like, who burns the most or least, thousands of pounds of fuel per hour, and then figure out the math to deliver as many bombs as possible with what I think is our biggest LIMFAC, which is number of booms and a quantity of JP-8 airborne. So I think in terms of the family of systems, it has to be target backwards. And then we also have to not be leaving out the support elements, tankers, just like I mentioned before, ISR, command and control, which may just be a network and not a platform. But we have to consider all the supporting elements, and it has to be target backwards.
Yeah, so we have 3 minutes left, panel. I want to hit our time on target, like a good bummer guy. So let's start with you, Buzzer. Perhaps in your final thoughts, you could address the need to ensure our planning staffs have the right expertise, our COCOMs and MATCOM.
Yes, I'll try to keep this brief. My experience in the joint warfighting staff was not very positive. It's too complicated. Not enough people have the authority they need to actually make the decisions that they have the information to do. So we're asking people with bad information to make decisions, and we're not putting the right people in the planning staffs. So I think we've made it way too complicated and way too big, and we aren't doing talent management. So we have to find a way to get the right warfighters onto those positions, and we have to enable continuity. You can't expect people to pick up the relationships in an entire community in 2 years at CENTCOM and then leave and effectively hand it off to their successor. So if the Air Force personnel system is holding us back and we can't overcome it, then we're screwed. It's our own system. So we have to figure out a way to deviate from that and make sure that we have the right people in the right places. And the last thing I'll add is most of our wars right now are Air 1 wars, and we can't keep having non-airmen in charge of planning these wars. And I rest my case with CENTCOM.
Here.
I will offer there's maybe a path to better synchronization and better outcomes down even to the theater AOCs, which is, there's 3 globally facing AOCs right now that are dealing with all the COCOMs every day, 616th, 618th, and 608th. If we more effectively integrate across those globally facing AOCs into the theaters, I think it's goodness all around. It's actually better outcomes in the theaters, but it's also better outcomes back to the globally facing activity, which is considering the range of things that are on the table.
Jerry, final word.
Yeah, final thoughts. It was almost 36 years to the date from the first flight when AV-1 Spirit of America took off from Palmdale to Operation Midnight Hammer, and I would say that's just a continued testament of the entire supply base and in partnership with the Air Force to be ready and to do it. I resonate a lot with Day 2, Operation Midnight Hammer, and I go right back to our sustainment posture and how we go fix it, immediately for the 509th and for Air Force Global Strike Command. I think that's a big opportunity for us where we're looking at, what is the LLM AI story on, reading the MyCaps today, but predicting the future tomorrow, next week, next year, 5 years, right? Because, you talk to these poor, maintenance group commanders and they're stealing parts. We're moving things around. We're trying, taking them from Palmdale back to the wing. So huge opportunity for us while we go align to the capability blueprint. So thank you.
Excellent. So panelists, thank you for that great discussion. We hit our time on target. Audience, please offer our panelists a warm